Hello, mathematicians. It's Miss Armgart back with another instructional video. Today we are looking at histograms. So we are organizing and interpreting our data. So the first thing that we need to go over is what is the distribution? So there are 5 different ways you can describe the distribution, that is where the data is on your histogram. So we have spread, cluster, peak, gap, and outlier. We're going to take those one at a time. So spread is the same as range. Of course, we like to have multiple words for the same thing. So if we look, our data goes from 25 to 1. So between 1 and 25 is our spread. The cluster is where a good chunk, a good portion of our data, there can be multiple clusters. On this histogram, we see most of our data is clustered between 1 and 15. So between 1 and 15, that's our cluster. Now a peak is a high point compared to both the left and the right. So in order to have the peak, you must have data on both sides. We have a peak right here at the 11 to 15, so between 11 and 15, that's our peak. That's the highest point of our data. So a gap, if there is a space in between sets of data, then that is a gap. So we have a gap right here between 16 and 20. And then an outlier is data that doesn't seem to fit. So our outlier in this instance, we have 2 in the 21 to 25 category. It doesn't really fit with our cluster, and there's a gap in between, so that would be our outlier. If there is no data to the left and right, you would say that instead of having a peak, it would be skewed right. So this portion right here, skewed right, you can also be skewed left. There is no peak on either of those because there is no data on both sides of the largest portion. So you can say it's skewed, but there is no peak. Now in the middle right here, if it is symmetrical, you have a peak. So now let's look at some examples of and use our vocabulary to describe these dot plots. So where does the data cluster? Remember, a cluster is a grouping of data. So it looks like in this 0 to 2 range, we've got a cluster. And in this 4 to 6. So I would write 0 to 2 and 4 to 6. We've got 2 clusters of data, 2 chunks, 2 distributions of data. So where are the gaps in the data? Remember, the gaps are where there is nothing. So we have a gap at 3. And then we have another gap again at 7 to 9. So there's a gap at 3. And from 7 to 9, there's no dots. There's no data. Where does the data peak? Remember, we have to have data on the left and the right. So we peak at 1 because we have data over here and data to the right. And we also peak at 5 because we have data to the left and data to the right. So there are 2 peaks in this graph. The highest point, kind of like mountains, there are multiple mountain peaks in any mountain range. For any histogram or dot plot, you can have multiple peaks. All right, so now we got to talk about, is this distribution skewed or symmetrical? Each of our clusters is symmetrical because we've got the peak in the middle and we've got data on either side, but we have this outlier over here at 10, so that is forcing our data to be skewed to the right. As you move from left to right, the data, the trend goes down overall. All right, so now we have a survey of students. Here is your data set. So the number of shoes that they currently own. So you can see this data is already organized from least to greatest. So now we are going to fill in a frequency table. That is just a way to have these categories and count how many of our data set fall into each category. So our first interval is 0 to 6. So we're just going to tally up. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I like to make tally marks 5, 6, 7, 8. So there are 8 total. In these 7 to 12, we don't have any. We go from 6 to 13. We have 0. From 13 to 18, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So we've got 4 there. From 19 to 24, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. And from 25 to 30, we've got 1. So now, from our frequency table, we can now create our histogram or dot plot because we know we have organized the data to make it easy to see. So from 0 to 6 right here, we have 8. So we're going to go up and 8. From 7 to 12, we've got 0. So there's going to be nothing there. From 13 to 18, we've got 4. Does it have to be perfect? Absolutely not. From 19 to 24, we've got 5. And from 25 to 30, we've got 1. So here is our histogram. Now we've created our histogram. We've got the height of the bar indicating the frequency for each of the shoes. So now your job is to describe the details of the histogram, the spread, the peak, the gap, the cluster, and the outlier. This is going to be a question on the formative. So once the video is done, make sure you analyze that histogram we just made. Don't forget about your vocabulary words. Don't forget to fill those in. And I am Miss Armgart. Happy solving, mathematicians.